The Gamba Army. So here we are. Last year, 2020-21 wet season, Northern Territory Government, in acknowledgement, decided $500,000 to help fund Gamba Army. In response that we know that Gamba's habitat transforming species, that it's a risk to assets, both biodiversity, people, natural, man-made assets. So the last season, job creation, in response to these displaced COVID workers, let's get them out there spraying Gamba grass instead. Also with job creation, there's, we wanted on-ground outcomes. Where could we actually get best bang for buck and make sure we made a difference and hit priority areas and valid areas that we could get some outcomes. And did it sit with the overall Gamba grass framework? So we did liaison with Weed Management Branch. So this little talk is a little bit about the Gamba Army. What did we achieve last year, 2021? And from that there are quite a few lessons learnt. And now, exciting, with the announcement recently of future funding, another $500,000 for the Gamba Army for the 2021-22 wet season. So we're just starting now to look at our priorities and initiatives for next season. So this will be basically what my talk's about, is what did we achieve and where are we going. Slide 2. So the first lessons learned and the first things we need to do is really where to pick your battlefields. Where do we deploy this army? It was very important that it complemented existing land manager control efforts, and that basically the army was putting additional workforce into priority areas. And the key priorities at the start were conservation areas such as the 3 national parks, Charles Darwin National Park, Casuarina Coastal Reserve, and actually Litchfield National Park. These were in conjunction with high amenity use. We also started looking at other areas that were impacting adjoining tenures. So we liaised with Department of Infrastructure, Planning and Logistics, DIPL, and the Crown Land Weed and Fire Officer Kelly on where should the Gamba Army be deployed to minimise impact on adjoining tenures, and where could we get leverage with existing investment. So where either NTG were putting investment, roads, Crown Land, could be Australian Government, Defence puts in significant investment, private people, even Aboriginal communities. So we looked at where did we need to go and put our Gamba Army. Involved engagement with obviously the relevant land managers who owned those parcels. And did I mention, again, exciting, NTG's now committed another $500,000 for the upcoming wet season. So as I said, the first priority where the Gamba Army, the first block we went into, and some of that was because it had been recently burnt, so you had really good green leaf regenerating, was Casuarina Coastal Reserve. And this was seen as a bit of a no-brainer, high amenity use, high public awareness. This was one of the lessons learnt and raised awareness with, you cannot just do one block or site in isolation if you're getting impacted by adjoining tenures. So Casuarina Coastal Reserve, as on this slide, is in blue. You'll see, for an example, those orange squiggles, that's one of the reserve blocks. They're the track logs that us guys out spraying, we tracked where we went, took photo monitoring sites. That was where we tracked over a few days in early December. But the other point, that's actually the hospital block, and that's managed by Department of Health, but it's got that top left, huge infestation of Gamba. It's non-managed and obviously keeps reinfesting Casuarina. So we needed to look at that whole cross tenure, and that also includes the Defence Housing Authority block that adjoins the hospital block and Casuarina Coastal Reserve. And there's a nice drone image of the hospital block that we're looking at that change in Gamba over time. So a really important lesson, we need to consider cross tenure. So example that these are some of the photos of the changes at Casuarina, and it also reinforces one of the other points that we need to consider spraying in conjunction with the interactions with burning. And so there's been some quite interesting, whether it burns post-spraying or pre-spraying, on really what happens to the native species and the ecology happening there. So parks actually burnt Casuarina Coastal Reserve. This is on the 6th of May. Ideally, it would have been great to say that we should be looking also at some earlier or through the wet season burns, that then we can spray and still maintain ground cover on the ground, reduce the risk of erosion. And then Litchfield National Park, another really significant priority for Gamba Army. We focused on the high priority areas for eradication between Bully Rockhole and Florence Falls. Lots of backpack work, but I have to admit it's not the worst country to be walking around carrying backpacks, although it was a bit of a slog for some of the people. But you can see in that slide, we found some isolated plants in the middle of otherwise non-disturbed native species, so it's really important to get those individual plants to avoid sort of subsequent spread. In the other park, Charles Darwin National Park, this is quite a good case study too on what happens with gamba grass over time. Again, high valued asset close to Darwin City, really good wilderness, serenity area, just 5 k's within the Darwin City. Another example, these were the track logs of where the teams were spraying. Example there of all the mountain bike tracks in there, that it's a really widely used and valued asset. So a good example of where the Gamba Army could go in and help support the work of parks. Charles Darwin, there's also been work done in there for considerable time, so it provides a good case study of the importance really of doing follow-up work, and that is why it was actually quite a relief to get follow-up funding for this year, because otherwise the issue is like, man, we did all that work over 2020, 2021. Geez, we've got to do the follow-up work, or where will we be in a few years' time? So these pictures actually illustrate from March 2016, dense, thick gamba in the park was sprayed by both parks and actually dorks, Darwin off-road cyclists, the mountain bikers as volunteers. Then we got wildfire through. Then we got, with no follow-up work, Gamba then came back as reinfestated. Then Gamba Army came in 2021 season, and there were some natives regenerating, but we're actually starting to make a difference and see all the natives coming back. And so there are areas that you actually can get wins, that gamba grass can be eliminated. See, I've used the word eliminated, not eradicated, because eradicated is a really serious weed management term. But that consistent follow-up is essential. And so did I mention the NTG has committed a further 500,000? So the first priority is to make sure follow-up work is conducted across all the sites from last season. Well, that's priority 1. And these pictures actually then also show from really dense gamba infestations in the park over time that we've got back to a clean native habitat with no introduction of other seeds, just nature coming back itself. Really important though, that interaction with fire, and try and keep fire out. So apart from the parks and conservation areas, then we started looking at other sites the Gamba Army could go. Sorry, we're up to slide 9. Other sites, this example, the Aviation Museum. So land management's not their core business, obviously. They were like, what do we do? They've got some volunteers come in and slash some of the areas. But this was a block that sat as a high gamba grass level in between. The Met Bureau sits to the west, has very little, if no, gamba on it. Obviously, the airport and defence have a significant investment and control their gamba, like my old mate there with the big slasher in the corner. You can see in the block, that's a defence at the background, clear of gamba, and the Aviation Museum still has its thick gamba in the foreground. And then there's some before and after shots. You might recognise the big red tower at the end of Hook Road there. So this was an example where we wanted that it was impacting across tenures and helped out basically a community type group. Also examples say roadsides that weren't being necessarily managed as part of any existing contracts, particularly where roads are going into a clean area, and that question on how to prioritise to keep clean areas clean, and how do we minimise those disturbances, and industries such as extractive industries, roadworks, Telstra towers, power, water, etc. That you have the 2 really key, that you have disturbance, and then there are also avenues for distribution. So Gamba Army conducted the roadsides, that's the roadside spraying into some of the extractive sites. But it does say, how do we get the extractive industries, those on board as well, to make sure that those areas are kept tidy. We also did, say, Howard Springs, which included pine forest. There's a forestry block. And again, because it borders onto Howard Springs Conservation Reserve, so we needed to do the tenures that adjoin on an area that's, making a concerted effort for gamba grass control. And the pine forest really widely used by local community. So it shows some before and after on some of the tracks. And the drone image there, that actually shows where the first round contractors went in. So that was a contracting employed through the Gamba Army. They did the buffers, and then TNRM Gamba Army went in and filled in the green bits in between. And the bottom picture shows an extractive area. The gamba's the green, that really this would have been taken drone imagery April, May. The gamba really stands out amidst all the native species that by then are starting to hay off. So slide 12. This another example shows the cross tenure issues. I called it Lambroli. That's the intersection of Lambrick Avenue and Zuccoli. The roads contract obviously does on the road verge. There's then Crown land internally, and also then abuts actually onto Palmerston Council land. But the line down the middle is this totally arbitrary line that goes through a whole patch of native scrub and gamba grass, and yet you're like, stop, change in tenure, pull up. So it really needs to be managed, say, as a combined block for better synergies and cost effectiveness. So really, we did over 30 sites across more than 50 land parcels, because a lot of the parcels that we did actually had combination of, as I said, of tenures in it. And this just shows all the sites that we did across Darwin. Yeah, we can find that on the TNRM website, but then they're just some of the examples of other places that we went. And so where we go in the future and where we didn't, Gamba Army probably wasn't utilised the previous wet season, are some of the roadside areas that it is part of an already existing contract, but there's some isolated patches that would probably be really important to pull up. So the strengths of the Gamba Army, that we could do this cross-tenure stuff. So we treated more than 30 sites across 50 different land parcels or tenures, encompassing more than approximately 7,000 hectares. And that cross-tenure thing's important because it means, that the bucket of money doesn't sit with a specific agency. So Crown does, will say, well, that's not our land, so we're not going to do that, because we've actually got to make sure that we, make sure we do our land and our obligations. So really important strength of the Army. And that's really agile, that for a scope of works, if we identified a site and they were like, yep, that could still getting done, say, example, Glendower Road that adjoins near Robinson Barracks, that I could write a scope of works on the Monday, get it approved, get it out to a contractor for some quotes by Tuesday or Wednesday. Contractor comes back with the quotes. We accept the winning contract, and the contractor can be on the ground on Saturday. Be really difficult to try and get that sort of agility with lots of other agencies. So we did use more than 6 different contractors as small businesses to help deliver as a component of the Gamba Army, as well as the TNRM team within the Gamba Army. And that gamba grass was the key focus. So it meant that is all the Gamba Army did, surprisingly. That's why they're called the Gamba Army. So we didn't get called away to go and manage, dogs that were running down the beach, or even by April, May, some of the other land managers, Defence, for example, even parks, they've started shifting their focus towards fire management, which makes sense. But we could keep spraying into June. So it meant we could get all these outliers, all the native species that hayed off. So we were getting very minimal collateral damage with spraying at that time of the year. So, our efficiencies on ground weren't diluted by trying to manage other land management type issues. Obviously, we employed probably more than 40 workers as part of the Army, so great for capacity building, had a lot of students from CDU, so they certainly got their practical experience out spraying, and even within some of the government and different agencies that they're like, oh, okay, that's how we can improve our management, or that we would help them and then they could carry on more with that work. Our quick spray units are currently in getting service ready for the next season, so it sort of shows then the Army also supported local business and the economy. There's one of our contractors, practical land management, out spraying those drains at Charles Darwin. So when you're driving down Tiger Brennan, you see those drains sprayed, good job, contractor and Gamba Army. A little bit on physiology with timing of spraying, won't go into this a lot, but it really, the timing when you spray, the interaction with burning and with slashing, really important for your effectiveness of your outcomes and getting this elimination of gamba grass. So I sort of paralleled it. There's no label actually with gamba grass on it, herbicide label, so paralleled it with some other similar species to gamba grass. So the future, did I mention there's another $500,000 for gamba spraying this 2021-22 wet season. So the priorities are obviously the follow-up work on all these sites. The next thing is into these new areas, so where do we go? We've started liaison this last week after the announcement with land managers already to say, where are your current contractors, where are your priorities going to be, where is the Gamba Army going to best fit? So really it's about how do we use all the money that's getting sprayed, who's already getting paid for gamba grass control, how do we use it more effectively? So even within tenure, so example Litchfield National Park, like where would we treat gamba for our best bang for buck? You know, that it's such a huge problem, like where do we start? And that could be using aerial application over some of the bulk areas, or it could be we go back in with backpacks or on ground to tidy up pre-existing areas. So we'll continue that prioritisation over the next couple of months before we really crank in with the on-ground work once it starts raining. And again, that cross tenure to make sure that we do across a geographic block, that we're not restricted by like who actually owns that land or whose tenure it is. And where it sits with the overall Gamba framework, with weed management branch and with the range of agencies and stakeholders, you know, maybe this involves that we develop a bit of a scope for a gamba grass, a weed management plan for the Darwin region. So we prioritise, you know, do we keep pushing back the gamba, say at Hidden Valley, so all the work at Charles Darwin that, you know, you don't get reinfestation. So we start looking at that's a gamba management at a region level. So that's really about it.